Alright, so this is the second installment of rule number 7. Use a colon after an independent clause to introduce a list, an explanation, or illustrative quotation. Okay, so last week we talked about basically 3 rules for the colons that you need to be aware of, okay, that aren't listed up here this week, but they are that it always needs to be preceded by an independent clause, a colon, okay. A colon is never going to separate a verb from its complement or a preposition from its object. Okay, and lastly, basically, the job description of a colon is that it announces what is to come. Okay, so last week it announced a list in our example. Right, a dedicated whittler needs these 3 tools, right? And then there was the list of those 3 things. Okay. Same thing with an explanation or an illustrative quotation. Okay, so what I have up here are 2 different quotations which sort of exemplify these last 2. Okay, so a colon can announce an explanation. Like you make a statement and then you explain that statement, and the colon goes in between those 2 statements. Okay, so if I read this sentence, I pulled out all the stops in my essay. I used 5 colons and 5 semicolons. Okay. We need to use a colon somewhere in there, right? You could just put a period between these 2 sentences, and that'd be all right. If you wrote it like it is up here, it'd be wrong. It's a run-on, right? Because you have 2 independent clauses. But you could separate it with a colon, right? And that would look even better. Because what this first statement does is introduce the second statement, right? The colon tells you, here's what I did to pull out all the stops in my essay. I used 5 colons, 5 semicolons. Okay, so you see how this first sentence and then the colon announces what is to come. All right. Now the second example, after that sobering event, so that was the explanation, right? Now let's look at an example of an illustrative quotation. After that sobering event, one quote was ringing in my ears. Man proposes, God disposes. Okay. So what's the quote? Well, it's man proposes, God disposes. So I need the colon there, right? And I could technically put quotation marks around that, right? Especially if it was a quote by a certain person that you're naming. Here, that's not the case, okay? So either way. But you see how I separate the quote from the sentence that introduces it. The colon announces, okay, here it is. Are you ready to hear it? That's the colon's job. It announces what is to come. It lets you know, here is what I was talking about. Here's the list of things you'll need, okay? Here's the explanation for how I pulled out all the stops in my essay. Right? Here's the quotation that was ringing in my ears. That's what a colon does. It announces what is to come. Okay? That's its basic task. Okay? Announces what is to come. And of course, back to the technical rules I mentioned at the start of the home lesson, it always has to have an independent clause before it. Okay? And it's never going to separate a verb from its complement or a preposition from its object. Okay, so use a colon after an independent clause to introduce a list, an explanation, or an illustrative quotation.